I'd like to welcome everyone. So thank you for joining. Again, good morning, or I guess for Dr. Carlson, it might be good evening for you. But thank you, Dr. Carlson, so much for joining us from so far away. It's too bad that we aren't able to meet in person, but given the situation with COVID around the world, I guess it's necessary for all of us to be flexible. I would like to introduce Dr. Carlson before he begins his presentation. He's a senior lecturer in Korean at SOAS in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. And his research focuses on social and institutional history of 19th century Korea and non-Hangul Korean script systems. He is widely published, and we are very honored that he is presenting this morning here for our conference. So I will hand it over to Dr. Carlson and let him take over the microphone.
Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be invited, not only to Korea University, but also into this metaverse, which is a strange experience. I've spent time at Korea University, and I really wished I could have been there. It would have been a nice experience, but unfortunately, it's not the case. I still have this new experience instead. Thank you very much for the kind introduction as well. Yes, so I'm at SOAS in London, and I'm working on Korean history. And today I'm going to talk about what I've been dealing with maybe the last 10 years or so. My main interest has been legal history, the legal history of the Joseon period. And so that is what I'm going to talk about. I mean, how does this work? I have a few slides. If I put them up, if I share my screen, will I disappear, or will that come up neatly on the screen? Okay, so I'll just get started with my talk. And as I said, yes, so my interest for the last decade or so has really been law and law's relationship to statecraft in Joseon, Korea. And I have been looking a lot into the Sokdae Jeon that was compiled during Yeongjo's reign. And as the theme for my talk, I took a phrase from the preface of that. So since times of yore, whenever there's been a country that has been a code, and I mean the purpose both of my research and what I wanted to stress in this talk is just the kind of central role that law had in Confucian statecraft, and that was also then in Joseon statecraft. So that's what I've chosen that as a theme for my talk. So first of all, then, so the importance of studying the legal history, to study the law of, be that the history of a legal system as it develops, or be that the legal system of a specific historical period. As I said, it's the legal system of a state is pivotal in its institutional system, and that system in turn, apart from times of serious social political upheaval, provides the framework for social, political, and economic activities in the state, and then also the possible trajectories of change within those areas. So that's why institutional history is important, and also then law playing a central part in that. Despite this, I would argue the study of the legal system of Joseon has been underrepresented in comparison to the amount of work produced on political, social, and economic history. While these works occasionally, those works in political, social, and economic history, make references to aspects of the legal system, frequently modern social theory has been applied to explain features of and changes in those areas, with maybe not sufficient consideration of that kind of surrounding state and institutional framework, as I say, which often dictate the possible trajectories. Well, it can only be a speculation. It seems to be maybe that one reason scholars have been reluctant to work in the area of institutional history, which would include legal history, is the role that this field played in early 20th century colonial historiography of like defining persisting traits in Korean socio-political history. And then also the notion that social and economic change occurred in the late Joseon period despite the state and its institutions. The real momentum of development would have been elsewhere. That said, of course, there are a number of scholars who have made important contributions to the field of legal history. Many of the pioneering scholars were legal scholars or political scientists rather than historians. You would have scholars like Park Byung-ho or Choi Jong-go that started to address issues of Korean traditional legal culture, and later legal scholars such as Chung Kyung-sik and Ham Jae-hak have developed or deepened the analysis of the legal textual foundations of the period and the relationship between law and statecraft. And while these legal scholars have brought positivistic analytical jurisprudence to the study of the Joseon period, historians that later then have started to show interest in the legal system, and that would be scholars like Han Sang-kwon, Kim Ho, Shim Ji-woo, and English language scholarship, Ji-soo Kim or Chong-won Kim. They approach it more from the viewpoint of what the American scholar Brian Tamana has called a realistic theory of law, which would be opposed to a more abstract, generalized approach, and then trying to understand more in detail the kind of historical specifics of the legal system and its interaction with society. So it's a much more contextualized and much more embedded within the history, within the culture, and within the society of the period. As I said, for me, I came to the legal system was chosen through my work in institutional history. So before that, I had worked a lot on famine and famine relief and other kind of aid policies of the state. And my main interest lies in the relationship between law and ideology. That is not simply then about how the dominant ideology is reflected in the legal system. I think that is something that we've seen in scholarship, be that in legal doctrines or in the legal outcomes, but rather how law is part of the ideology, or as the British historian E.P. Thompson put it, that law is ideology. It's really bringing ideology and statecraft and law together. There is a subtle change in focus. That is, it is not ideology reflected in law, but actually law as ideology. In an East Asian context, this kind of emphasis of law might sound unconvincing if you've read the Confucian classics and the de-emphasized then the importance of law. But I think it would be obfuscating the kind of development of legal thought in East Asia with such kind of ideological positions that would focus then rather on rule by virtue or rule by ideology, be it Tokji or Yechi. And see that as the kind of basis for seeing Confucianism and what is then known as legalism as mutually exclusive schools in the development of East Asian statecraft. So even if rule by law was considered a sign of lack of morality, so there's rule by punishment, the rule of law, that is, rule according to the law, that everybody should follow the law. That was an integral part of the emphasis of human statecraft within Confucianism. In my research, I mean, I don't claim to be the first one to look at it from this point of view. While earlier scholarship on traditional East Asia or Korean law tended to emphasize the relative unimportance or arbitrariness of law in Confucian statecrafts, and that at times also came with unfavorable comparisons with generalized understandings of what the Western legal tradition might have been. Much contemporary scholarship reflects a much more appreciative approach, I think. I would argue, though, that this is often based on a positive revaluation of Confucian statecraft and not so much reflecting a new understanding of the role of law within the overall socio-political system. And so maybe it's overly ambitious for me, but I will try to, in my future research, address what I think is missing in that sense. So the role of state ideology then is to justify the dominant social order. And of course, with that comes any inequalities the system contains. With the legal system then being part of the state machinery and reflecting state ideology, the legal system also reflects such social inequalities. That would not be surprising. But once again, that has, as E.P. Thompson, the British historians, has argued, if the legal system is going to be convincing as a system supporting ideology, it must maintain its own fairness. That in whatever manner that fairness is formulated, so that it can't arbitrarily reflect social power relations without losing its power as ideology. As in a sense, it is caught within its own rhetoric to a certain extent. So with this research interest of mine, as I said, the last couple of years I've been engaged in kind of in-depth analysis of the new legislation that was added in the Sokdaejeon, the new dynastic code then compiled during the reign of Yeongjo. And for the purpose of my research interest, as I outlined above, this is an important and useful source in several ways. First of all, from the discussions surrounding its compilation, it is clear that for Yeongjo, this new code was part of his larger project of a Confucian-based dynastic restoration. It is really central in his project. It played a central part in how he envisioned statecraft. Also, as much of this new legislation was based on royal edicts, often royal rulings in particular cases, this in a sense is a way of looking at both legal doctrine and legal outcomes. It is always engaging with specific cases as well. And the fact that much of this new legislation was based on these royal rulings often make it more ideologically charged as well. The presentation will consist of 3 parts, or the lecture of 3 parts. First, it will look at the ideological background of the Sokdaejeon, as reflected in the preface and also in discussions surrounding the compilation, so discussions at court surrounding the compilation of this code. And then the 2 following parts deal with one aspect of the justification of the legal system. I said some aspects of its fairness that was needed for it to be able to function as a state-supporting ideology. And what I will look at is efforts to keep the distinction between the public Hong and private Sa within legislation and within legal outcomes, and so maintaining that strict separation between the public and the private, as it would be one way to instill that kind of fairness, the rule of law within the legal system, which helps them to support it as a state-supported ideology. And in those 2 sections, the starting point will be the starting point of 2 case studies, 2 pieces of new legislation that we can see in the Sokdaejeon, and both deals with that differentiation between public and private. Okay. So ideology then, and we jump back to England and back to the 20th century, the English philosopher Bertrand Russell has said that mankind has never yet succeeded in enforcing cohesion but merely rational arguments. And without necessarily making the argument that ideological elements are irrational, I think this could be applied to the social role of legal systems, in the sense that even in a society that arguably could be defined as being characterized by the rule of law, acceptance of the legal system is in the end based on faith in that system. In most cases, law-abiding citizens do not respect the law based on detailed and thorough knowledge of the system, the laws and the fairness, but rather because they trust the system, they trust the state and the laws. And then the question is, how is such faith in the system achieved? Among other things, this charisma could be provided by notions of the democratic state. We're living in a democratic state, so therefore we trust the legal system. Or it could be the sagacious and benevolent ruler that we trust would ensure that the legal system is fair. So the norms and the values in that sense supporting consensus should thus be reflected in the legal system to provide the basis for that faith in the system. In the case of Korea, historian Kim Ho, he has argued that late Joseon royally led legal development should be understood as an effort to create a legal culture based on widespread consensus on the moral principles and human sentiments that should be taken into consideration in conjunction with the law. So then that would be the basis for the fairness of the legal system. So all these various moral principles and human sentiments should combine as well in the legal discourse. If we move on to Sokdaejeon, the new law code, by the early 18th century, the textual legal basis of the Joseon dynasty was rather complicated. So in terms of the penal law, we not only had the parallel use of the Great Ming Code, the Taemyeongyul and the Dynastic Code, but also a number of extensions, the Songnok to the Dynastic Code, Royal Edict collections, Sugyo Chimnok as well. And to address that issue, and Yongjo, you said that if when the laws get old, that they become complicated or confusing. So in an effort in trying to deal with this, there was a compilation of the Cholok Tongo, and that was during the reign of Sukjeong in the early 18th century. That has then been already an effort in trying to bring some order within that rather complex legal textual basis. So if we already had this Cholok Tongo, so why would then Yongjo still go ahead and compile the Sokdaejeon? From the first instances of when the need to improve the textual basis for the legal system was started to be discussed in the court of Yongjo, it was clear that the framework was larger than simply legal reform. In 1730, Yongjo referred to the Kukjo Uryoi, or the Five Rights of State, and the Gyeongguk Taejong as the good law and the beautiful system, and said that not being able to use them is as frustrating as not being able to eat the rice and the panchan in front of you. So you have this perfect system, but over the years it become complicated and you can't use it, and being frustrating. Comparing it with the lack of a proper system in Korea, he praised the dynastic establishment finalized in the reign of Sejong with the publication of these two texts. But he pointed out that it was a fact that the Gyeongguk Taejong by his own reign was old, and parts of it was obsolete, and this caused negligence by officials. Evoking the old saying that if you want to emulate Yao and Shun emperors, you should emulate your predecessors, and he said that it had been his wish for a long time to polish and elucidate the Gyeongguk Taejong. Still, if there existed any differences between the current system and the dynastic code, that could have been solved by supplementing the current system through the Cholok Tongo, of course. So what this entry, this statement by Yongjo tells us that this was more part of this larger project of dynastic restoration. It was bigger than just legal reform. And this is corroborated by the fact that at the same time there is a new version of the Cholok Tongo being compiled as well, the Chungbo Cholok Tongo. So that is being done parallel to the compilation of the Soktejan, which then has, as I said, a much more ideological purpose. Later arguments for more innovative work can also be seen in 1736. The White State Council Song In-myung argued that as for the way of ruling the country, if even a minimum of peace was to be achieved, the penal system needed to be, once again, polished and elucidated. However, looking at the situation at the time, it was difficult to rule the country since the penal law was unclear, as Song In-myung claimed. This time, however, making references to the practice of hanging edicts at the gate, he argued that laws were crucially needed. The clues that were crucially needed should be extracted, improved, published, and disseminated. Song Jin-myung explained that such an order had already been given, but the work is not yet commenced. Since the order had already been given, why not choose persons from among the higher officials of the Border Defense Command to work on the revision with officers from the Ministry of Punishment and produce a book? The king agreed that if the penal code is unclear, the people can't get on with their lives, and he ordered that the officials of the Ministry of Punishment to commence the work as well. So that's the beginning then of the compilation of the Soktejan. And it commenced in the 6th month of 1744. Yongjo provided a preface, a chair for the Soktejan, and the basic fact that generally speaking, since days of yore, when law gets old, they become complicated. So is given as the reason for the compilation of this new code. And being humble, he depreciated his own work. Just the Gyeongguk Taejeon is the legal code of our country. If you open the book, the sagacious rules are there for everyone to see. And so how could a person of such shallow moral worth as myself dare to supplement it? He continued by stating that this new code was only compiling together the supplementary code and royal edict collections. So giving it in this preface more of a kind of humble purpose. But there was, of course, also an ideological dimension expressed in the preface. So once again, a quote, the laws become more complicated for each day and the principles gradually sink into disorder. The officials play tricks as they please, and the people don't know what to do. The problem with legal ambiguity is thus that it either represents or can lead to or facilitate moral decay. The flourishing virtues and bestowed laws of my predecessors were all based on humanity and benevolence. But times have degenerated, customs have been corrupted, and the old customs have gradually been swept away. The gist of the Soktejan lies precisely in this. If you ask what the gist is, the answer is magnanimity and benevolence, end of quote. This attitude can also be seen very clearly in an exchange that the king had with one of the compilers. The king asked one of the compilers if there was anything in the penal section of the new code that needed to be revised. The person was Kutekyu, and he answered that the section in its whole was to convenience to the people, and if it had any flaws, it was that it was too magnanimous. To which the king answered, if magnanimity is for the benefit of the people, what is there to regret? And so the quote that I has as the theme for the talk shows the perceived central role of law code in the establishment of a state. The compilation of such a code was portrayed as a meritorious deed of the early kings or emperors of the dynasty in their establishment of the kingdom or empire. And then the perceived role of the Gyeongguk Taejong in the beginning of the Joseon dynasty was no different. In the preface of the Search to the Sokjin, that was composed by Won Kyung-ha, who was the deputy director of the Office of the Royal Decrees. That preface states, and I quote, "Our Taejo in his establishment of the dynasty, firstly setting the foundation, in the great regulations and broad plans resemble the three dynasties, those of Xia, Xiang, and Zhou in China. He created the legal system, and only through the existence of the original code and the supplement have generations of sagacious rulers been able to follow the old laws." However, as we have seen in the 18th century, then moral decay was part of the ideological message, and if early rulers could distinguish themselves through the establishment, later rulers could distinguish themselves through dynastic restoration, or chunghul. It would, of course, be presumptuous for the king to claim that he was involved in dynastic restoration, and we have seen the manner in which he depreciated his work. But reading between the lines and looking at discussions at court surrounding the compilation of this new law code, it is clear it was considered to be part of such a restoration of the dynasty, and as such played a central role in the legacy the king was to bestow on following generations. In the fourth month of 1740, when the year when the decision to compile the new law text was made, the king, in discussions with his ministers, explained, "Rulers who establishes or restores a dynasty blesses the country for a long time by respecting magnanimity, but the countries that later demise use harsh punishment. The people involved in the compilation of this book must keep this fact in mind." He then exemplified it with the famous story of how, although Emperor Wen of Han had abolished harsh corporal punishments, Emperor Wu later used them, famously then on Sima Qiang. He then linked this with his own prohibition of knee pressing and branding and the punishments of tattooing and banishing whole families to the border area. So stressing his own benevolent policies, then would put his own endeavors on the level of a kind of dynastic restoration. Furthermore, towards the end of 1744, when the compilation of the new law text was completed, the king started to describe this as a great achievement of his rule. On the first day of the 12th month, he called the royal secretary and the officials of the Office of Special Advisors, took out and showed them two royal portraits. He said, "The purpose of taking these portraits out is not for you to have a look. I want later generations to look at these and follow the intentions of my great instruction. Now that the compilation of Sokdaejeon, Sok-Urye-Ui, and the Great Instructions is completed, although it has not been done until I am old, I feel that I have completed my task." The new law text was continuously discussed as one of the king's legacies at court. On the 25th day of the same month, after the king had prohibited the collection of tax money in lieu of unavailable tributes as corrupt second state, Councillor once again Song In-myung praised the king, exclaiming, "The now completed compilation of Sokdaejeon and Sok-Urye-Ui derive from my lord's wish to bestow your great way upon later generations and care for them from a distant past. Please don't say that your work is done and guide us even further." If the king needed to be humble and restrain himself in any claims of dynastic restorations, his minister could be more outspoken. The preface that I referred to earlier by Won Kyung-ha states, and I quote, "Our king loves the people, is frugal in material goods, and has inherited the polities of his predecessors. His benevolent laws and beautiful systems also correspond with those of Zhou and are great in brightness and continuity." It is what Confucius called continuing the intentions and deeds of your predecessors, and the fulfillment of filial piety is complete. He has furthermore abolished knee-pressing and branding and alleviated the punishment of family banishment to the border areas. His moral intentions are flourishing, and he is able to receive and maintain the great mandate. So the abolishment of the corporal punishment by Emperor Wen is not sufficient in its greatness, and your minister gathers his hand and waits for the rule without punishment of Emperor Yao and Shun. And in this praising of this new law text, you can see in the end that we come back to that ideological notion that good rulership is rulership without punishment. So we can see these can coexist very well side by side. Okay, so that's the end of the first section of my lecture. So just showing how ideologically important then the compilation of the Sokdajan was for Yongzhou and this larger project of dynastic restoration, and how it very much interlinks with the kind of moral sentiments and moral values and human sentiments that would have been part of that larger restoration. So if we move on to the next part, so public versus private and the justification of the legal system, or ways in making the legal system fair. And the first example we'll be looking at the jailing. And the first clause in the sugum, or the detention part of the penal section in Sokdajan, states that the Nesa Ok, which was the jail in the Nesusa, which was the agency in charge of court finances, had been abolished in the 37th year of the reign of King Sukjong. This is a very short statement to the fact. In a sense, it's not a prescriptive law, it's just a description of changes in the legal system. But it really comes at the beginning then of the new legislation that's being introduced. And the case behind this ruling, the prohibition or the abolishment of this Nesok, the jail, tells us much about what role the distinction between public and private had in the justification of the legal system. And I'm sorry, I think I need to shorten down a little bit in my lecture to the printed version. I will go on too long, so I hope you will be able to follow me, even if I skip a little bit ahead. A conspicuous feature of the institutional structure of Chosun was the widely bestowed judicial authority to various parts of the bureaucracy. That was really central. There was not much separation between the judiciary section of the bureaucracy and the civil sector of the bureaucracy. In the counties, in the countryside, both those powers, the civil and the judicial powers, were held by the magistrate, and a wide range of civil, provincial, and capital institutions also wielded judicial powers, in addition to the authorities specializing in legal affairs that we had in the capital. And the most widely given judicial power was the right to arrest. In principle, all government institutions, central and local, had this right. In the capital, they were only divided between those that had to liaise with the Ministry of Punishment for the arrest and those who could do this on their own accord. And the latter was referred to as Chiksu Amun. And despite these broad rights to arrest that any person with official authority had, in the capital, jailing should only be done in one of the established jails, and that would be the Chamoksa, the Ministry of Punishment, and the Kumbu Ok of the State Tribunal, and the jail of the capital police bureau. However, given these broad rights for arrest, institutions needed to detain the people they arrested, and they frequently built their own jailing facilities. And this then occasioned discussions and new legislations in the 17th and 18th century that we will look at. So this section will then analyze the discussions and new legislation surrounding the Näsa och of the Royal Treasury. And the various, the name for these detaining facilities would have been the Kurjukan, and we will discuss those. So I'll skip a little bit. Yeah, so given the importance to follow proper procedure, so the rule by law in that sense, the jail that we had in the Näsusa was an anomaly, because that was not part of the official jails that we did have in the capital. And there was an incident in 1652 that occasioned critical voices to be raised against this jail. So what happened was that on the 27th day of the 5th month of 1652, the Office of Special Advisors, the Hongmonguan, submitted a petition detailing the case of a certain Han Huiyu. This Han Huiyu claimed to be a commoner whose daughter had been taken by force to the palace to serve at court in the female quarters when he had protested to the king using the petition system. Sangon. He had been briefly put in the Näsa och, or in this jail that belonged to the royal treasury. As opposed to the official jailing, created two separate streams of prisoners. There's one official, one public, and then that private stream of prisoners. This was something learned men had complained about for a long time, they claimed. To make matters worse, in this case, the eunuchs of the Näsa had detained someone from outside the court, which would be beyond their authority. 3 days later, the office of the Censor General, the Sagan, submitted a petition sternly criticizing the king. They say that the office of the Näsusa in itself deviated from the principle that the king should have no private ambitions, and if, in addition, a jail was constructed there, it would inevitably lead to repeated mistakes. Han Hiu, so the person at the center of this controversy, would not have been the only person from outside the court who had been jailed there, they claimed. So the capital had both the state tribunal and the Ministry of Punishment, so they asked why not bring cases there and have them dealt with properly. The king, though, was unapologetic and claimed that he had ordered Han's arrest since he was making false statements and spread false rumors in the capital, and thus deserved to be punished. So I find this to be a very interesting case. We see the ideal of proper procedure, which then adds to the fairness of the system, clash with the private, or the so-called private interest of the court and actually the king. I find that like an interesting definition as well of what the private would have been. This time, however, things calmed down after some bureaucratic infighting and calls for resignations, but the criticism against the Näsa would continue, now mainly with the focus on the fact that it was eunuchs who managed this jail and that it therefore was not supervised by a proper authority. The following year, 1653, in a long petition outlining 21 points that the government needed to address to avoid natural calamities, First Minister without portfolio, Lee Kyung-oh, called for the abolishment of this jail. The framework for his argument was that, once again, the private character of the court and the public character of the authorities. He lamented the fact that the royal court and the government agencies were separated in these matters, and when a crime occurred involving royal in-laws or concubines, it was not forwarded to the proper officials, but instead dealt with by palace eunuchs, opening up for improper practices guided by private intentions, or sa. The NESOC should therefore be abolished, and all cases at the Royal Court refer to the Ministry of Punishment. In 1657, it was the Office of the Inspector General, the Sahunbu, that submitted a petition asking the king why he had not rectified this situation yet. All criminals need to be handed over to the officials, they argued, and be dealt with by the law. Why did the king feel the need to have separate jail where the palace eunuchs could exercise arbitrary power at will? He must surely be aware that this runs counter to the principle that the royal court and the government agencies are one body, they argued. The Office of the Censor General demanded its abolishment again in 1688, this time to Sukjong, who was then in his 14th year on the throne. But it would not be until 1711, then in the 37th year, that Sukjong finally abolished this jail, comparing it to the prison of the Northern Office of the Yellow Gates from the Han Dynasty in China, a prison that was infamous for holding political prisoners and enemies of the imperial eunuchs. So it's a quite damning naming of this jail. That was not the end of discussions about private jailing, though. With a lot of agencies having the right to detain, they actually themselves had these detaining facilities or the kuryukan. And in 1722, it was reported that the Ministry of Punishment had one. The concern was that the staff neglected the suspects placed there, since it was parallel to the official system, and the people put in those kuryukan or detaining facilities, they were never properly reported. This arbitrary confinement constituted private imprisonment, sa-ok, and should be prohibited by law. 3 years later, in 1725, now Yeongjo on the throne during a royal lecture, Yu Pong-myung advised that it would be proper to abolish all of these facilities, the kuryukan, reflecting the same concerns that Cho Kyung-myung had. Quite a long quote, telling quote of what he said. So, the people of the city are suffering many difficulties and hardships. Even if we already have the Chonokso, various judicial agencies, the 5 military garrisons, and other agencies all have their own arrest facilities. These are always full of suspects, so how can the people not suffer difficulties? Since those detained there are not entered on the list of prisoners, they are not included in any amnesty of prisoners. It is advisable that from now on, that only those from the 3 judicial bodies, that would be the Ministry of Punishment, the Hansan Municipal Authorities, and the Office of the Inspector General, the 5 military garrisons and various agencies that can be jailed are put in the Chonokso, and that the regulations concerning and practice of keeping people arrested in various agencies are all abolished. We keep having these discussions surrounding this, but these arresting facilities keep being rebuilt. They keep coming back because they were needed. So this, I think, it clearly shows once again the effort in keeping the rule of law, in the sense that the official judicial procedures should be followed, and any kind of private intentions and private jailing should be prohibited. But at the same time, the legal system in itself often worked in a way and it was needed for these agents to detain people, and they needed some kind of facilities to have that done. So these discussions would keep on going for a very long time. Okay, once again, I think I'll need to cut quite drastically in the paper I have presented. And so move to the next case that I wanted to talk about. And once again, we have a law entered in the Soptejon. It's in the excessive punishment part of the Namhyang part of the Soptejon. So it says, even an official on an embassy carrying royal orders who kills someone over private matters should be punished with the principle of a life for life, that is the death punishment. And this is intriguing, this law. I mean, it is part of the way in which legislation in the Chosen period was very specific and very case specific. It might be surprising that we have a new law stipulating that high-level officials did not have the right to murder. But it's of course related to their closeness to the highest authority, and once again the concomitant strong right to punish came with that. And once again here it was a matter of deciding how public the killing had been. And so once again here it is someone who kills over private matters, then it becomes problematic. So the source of this new law was a royal edict issued by Sukjong, that was in 1685. It was occasioned by a case involving a high official named Chong Jae-son. Chong Jae-son had for a long period held the position of Ji-pyong, or a minor inspector at the office of the Inspector General. In 1684, he was appointed to go with an embassy to China. In the 8th month of that year, the office of the Censor General informed the king that reports had come in that when arriving in the Pyongyang province on the way into China, Chong Jae-son had started to look for runaway slaves of his in the province. And wherever he went under the influence of alcohol, he flogged them so severely that 5 people had died. So they asked that he should be arrested and brought in for interrogation, and the king agreed to this. So this is then the specificities of this lease. So he was going on an embassy to China as an official, but on the way then in the Pyongyang province for his own private reasons, tracking down his own escaped slaves. He killed multiple people. On the 13th day of the 12th month, that day the king discussed the case with his ministers again, as he had received a report from the provincial governor. According to this report, Chong had not only killed slaves, but among the dead were also 2 commoner husbands of female slaves, known as Pibu, and 1 commoner as well. And this makes now the case much more serious. As for the 2 commoner husbands, the king said that although there was a proverb saying that the life of a commoner husband of a slave with children does not need to be paid with life, that was not the law. The purport of this proverb was that once such a husband had a child with a slave status wife, he was himself considered to be of similar status. Since he had also killed a commoner, so this was now a very serious matter, and it looked difficult for him to avoid the death penalty. The discussion then turned to the proper punishment for his crime. The king introduced a case from the reign of Hyojong. When in 1658, a former 3rd inspector at the office of the Inspector General named Yi Chun had ordered one of his slaves to murder a person with whom he was in a legal dispute over slave ownership. Yi had been brought in for interrogation but had not confessed and died as a result of the torture he was made subject to. The argument was made, however, that this case was different and rather thought it should be compared with the case involving a person named Kang Sok-yu, whose punishment had been lowered since the person he killed had been a former slave. So we can see the nature of the social status of the people involved becomes important, and also to what extent the relationship would have been private or not. This was seconded with the argument that since Lee Chung had secretly murdered the person he was in legal dispute with, there were no mitigating circumstances and the court had to apply the law, and that the case of Chung differed from this. The state tribunal was ordered to look at previous cases, including that of Kang Sok-yu, and they came up with a suggestion that also Chung should be punished with banishment. The day after receiving the report, the state tribunal, the king discussed the case again with his ministers. State Councillor Kim Soo-hang confirmed the view that there were enough precedents to lower the punishment to banishment, and based on this and the report from the state tribunal, this was the final decision of the king, and Chung was actually banished to Kangjin by a special pardon in this case. So he would not have been punished according to this, as we can see later, new law in the Soktojan. So we can see that this was not the end of the matter. On the third day of the second month, Minister of Rights Lee Min-se protested, saying that given the severity of the crime, Chung Jae-sun should not be allowed to avoid the death penalty. And the king admitted that the ruling had been based on special considerations, taking precedence into consideration, and that if officials and embassies to this as president giving them a license to kill, the problem would be endless. And so he ordered that henceforth any official on an embassy carrying royal orders killing people for personal reasons would have to pay for this with their life, which is then the ruling on which the royal edict later was based. So they let Chung Jae-sun off the hook, but were afraid, as they said, that it would give people with a kind of authority the license to kill. So that's why this law was introduced. As we see, then this case led to conflict between the king and officials in the office of the Inspector General. When compiling the annals, the historians later summarized this case as follows, and I quote, Chung Jae-sun was an envoy recorder, was a Sojangwan, and had previously been in the office of the Inspector General, so he had the right to mete out punishment. But he could not suppress his sudden anger, and due to the private matter of trying to retrieve runaway slaves, he killed 6 people, and one of these was a commoner. So, if the law of the dynasty was to be applied, he could not escape the death penalty. But due to his influence, the state tribunal could not suggest application of the law, and only after the king had reprimanded them did the officials start to discuss it. If this is needed for the private not to be able to overtake the public, how can the country be managed? So once again, the strong criticism. Once again, it's the way in which private interests then overtake public proper procedures. There's a very strong criticism of it in this statement. So I think this is another interesting and good case that really shows how trying to maintain the differentiation between public and private to give the legal system that fairness. Okay, I'll wrap things up. So the aim of this talk, this lecture, has been to emphasize the important role law played in the Joseon state, its ideology and statecraft, despite the frequent use of phrases such as the rule without punishment of Empress Yao and Shun. I mean, we can certainly see them constantly emerging in the sources. And that would be then the way to describe ideal kingship. As I said, rule by law, punishments was strongly cautioned against. By rule of law, that is fair and consistent application of the law according to the law code, was part of the concern of the king for the welfare of society. And to exemplify how the legal system as part of state ideology was justified by its adherence to fairness, and the talk then looked at the distinction that was made between public and private. And so even if the legal system contained inequalities reflecting the social order, and even if the line between civil and judicial authority tended to be blurred often, the ideal was to keep arbitrariness in check by ensuring that private matters did not influence procedures or encroached upon the punitive authority of officials. Okay, I'll stop sharing my slide.
Professor Carlson, thank you so much for your presentation and for this very enlightening lecture on the relationship between law and ideology and the role of law in the socio-political system of the mid-Joseon dynasty. I found it very interesting to see how you describe and explain the distinctions between public and private that Yeongjo was trying to make, and how this then helped to justify the legal system at that time.